What makes a bad sermon bad? We're talking about that today on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. AJ, heard my fair share of bad sermons. What about you?
Yeah, we get around a bit. We're not always sitting in our own church pew. We're frequently in somebody else's church pews. So yeah, we get a lot of different sermons.
Yes. Heard some good ones. Heard some bad ones. And I would say the vast majority are somewhere in the middle. And that's maybe some comforting news if you're listening to this. And so my encouragement to you today, as we begin to go through the anatomy of a bad sermon, or you can think of these as really bad sermon habits, is to maybe not think, oh yeah, I don't do any of that. I want you to do some self-reflection. Maybe go back and watch 2 or 3 of your most recent sermons and audit yourself and go, am I doing any of this? Is this something that I'm guilty of doing? My guess is that at least one of these things is something that you maybe have a tendency towards. And I'll be, as you can count on in this podcast always, I will let you know which of these 5 is the one that I, when I'm preaching, I tend to fall victim of. Because
I think all of the
all transparency podcast.
That's true. At least from your side of the microphone. None of these are really like in your face, super obvious, beat you over the head things. A lot of them are very nuanced and maybe even get more into some of the finer points of a good sermon. So you might be,
sure.
Yeah, but any of these could be taken a little bit if you're maybe particularly into a particular style, or you have particular bad habits. It could be elevated to more obvious levels.
Yeah. So, I think that this will be helpful, even if you're a pretty effective preacher. And I assume a lot of you are, that stick with us from beginning to end here, because I really believe that we can always improve. We can always get a little bit better in our preaching. And these tips will help you.
Yeah. Hey, did you know that the Malphurs Group is a nonprofit ministry? We are. And the reason we are is so that we can take everything that we do to churches outside of the United States at no cost. But we need support from churches like yours or you individually. Let me tell you about a church in Mexico right now that we've already said yes to, and we're just waiting for the funding to be able to make this trip happen. They're presently going through some of Dr. Aubrey Malphurs' materials and have contacted us saying, will you come down and help us work through all of these pieces so we can put it all together? They're right there, ready to go, and we just need to get there to them. But we need your help to do that. We have stories just like this in numerous countries in Europe and in Africa where we constantly are getting contacted. Go to malphursgroup.com/donate so that your church can become a partner with us to bring this global ministry further and further.
And now, back to the episode.
All right, well, let's dive right in, Scott. Number 1 is related to poor pacing in your delivery, tone, and tempo. So this is all more in the delivery topic here. And Scott, you bring in, in quotes, preacher voice, and every public speaker and certainly every pastor definitely has this going, and it's in extremes, it can even become a caricature. But most people are not at that level. But it is their own style, but sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So yeah, let's unpack this one a little bit more.
Sure. So I think if I say preacher voice, immediately a lot of you listening, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And you actually may have a different preacher voice in mind. So yeah, I mean, if you're talking about old Southern Baptist preacher voice, is one thing, historically Black church preacher voice is a different thing. And then I do think that there's almost like this contemporary evangelical preacher voice, which is a different thing. The closest thing that I can think of to preacher voice in its authentic form would maybe be Matt Chandler. So this idea of being able to, I'm going to maybe speak a word and then linger on the last consonant of the last word that I'm saying in a sentence, and using the hands in such a way that I'm saying something very specific, and very odd and awkward pauses at sort of the end of a sentence. This is sort of evangelical preacher voice, if you know what I'm talking about. You've heard this, we've all heard it, and there, you know, if you're on Instagram or TikTok, you've probably seen comedians make fun of this. I put an example of this in the show notes today at malphursgroup.com/191. If you've not seen some of these folks on TikTok and Instagram who make fun of it, you can see an example there. But so what you might think I'm going to say then as the solution to this, AJ, is that pastors should avoid preacher voice. And that's not my advice. Instead, I think you should be more thoughtful about how you speak. My problem with preacher voice is that it's an affectation. It's not real. And so it's not the same. Speaking to you on this podcast, which is essentially me talking to AJ on Zoom, which is no different. It's not significantly different than if I was sitting across the table from you at a coffee shop or a cafe or a restaurant. It is different than if I'm speaking on a stage to 50 or 100 or 500 or 1,000 people. It is different. So it's okay that when you're on stage, you have a different presentation and delivery than you would if you were sitting across from someone at a coffee shop.
Yeah.
What I'm suggesting, though, AJ, is that people be more intentional about what that looks like, rather than having an affected preacher voice that they're mimicking from Matt Chandler or someone else, or just generic, evangelical preacher voice. So we can talk a little bit more about this if you'd like, but I thought I'd take a breath and let you interject.
Yeah, well, I think this is certainly a good point in which any of us that preach or speak publicly can self-reflect a little bit. Like, how much do I turn on something when I hit the stage or the podium, versus just what I'm comfortable with, and how I want to intentionally and strategically bring certain points home for folks so that they understand them. That's the idea. That's the strategy that a good preacher would be trying to do. Is like, this is a really important. I want to make sure people get this. And that's, I guess that's the balancing act. Like, I want to, my tool is my voice and my body language, my hand movements. And how you use those to make a point is what this is all about. And so it is natural and it's good, and you should be doing things that would bring these points home. But I guess you can just kind of tip that over to a little bit too far.
Yeah.
And I guess the other important piece of this, Scott, is strategic use of these tools. If you're employing the same tool all the time or constantly throughout your talk, then it's like, that's kind of like the saying of it, if everything is of greatest importance, then nothing is of any importance,
Right.
If my vocal tools are constantly in use, then I've not made anything particularly important.
Yeah. So some practical tips here. I want to get real specific. And I'm a recovering theater kid. I, in high school, did a couple of musicals and plays.
Jazz hands.
Jazz hands. And I do think that gives, if you ever did theater or something like that, it gives you an advantage in preaching, because preaching isn't, it's not a show or whatever, but there are skills you learn in theater that are helpful. one of the skills you learn very early on is getting off book, which means you memorize your lines. And if you've ever seen a really amateurish type play, like you've gone to a high school or middle school performance of something, and you can tell the kid who doesn't really know their lines, even though they're not holding the script, you can see them in their head. They are reading that script. And so they're not embodying the character because they don't know their lines. When you don't know your material, when you don't know your sermon, and I'm not suggesting that you have to manuscript your sermon and have memorized every word. People have different approaches to that. All of that is fine. But what I'm saying is you need to know it. You need to know what you're going to say and have rehearsed that. And that might sound strange. Maybe it's been a long time since you've done that. But even as long as I've been in ministry and as many times as I've preached, there's not a single time that I have preached that the night before, either at my own house, if somewhere local, or in my hotel room, I did not run through that thing out loud. Now I might be at like 50% volume so I don't wake someone up in my own house or freak out the person in the next room. But I am running through that and I'm thinking through where am I going to pull back? Where am I going to lean in? Thinking about those things is really important. You need to know your stuff and you need to practice it out loud. The other thing I would say about that, AJ, is you need to learn how to read the room. So practicing it is one thing, and then you got to get in the room and see how it's landing. So don't have the lights completely down. Bring the house lights up just enough for you to be able to see people and read if they're with you. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago on the podcast when we talked about apathy, but just being able to understand the emotions of the room and reflect them and then lead people. So I don't want to get stuck on this first point for too long, but I do want you to think about what is your preacher voice? What's your tone? What's your tempo? And when you hear monotone, you might think I'm talking about I'm down here all the time and this is monotone, but there are other types of monotone. You can be up here the whole time. I'm out here, and let me tell you this. And if I stay at this intensity level the entire sermon, that's also monotone. It's just a high energy monotone, and it's exhausting. Yeah. So you have to learn how to vary your tempo, your pace, the intensity level, lean in, pull back, and all of that should be a reflection of what's happening in the room, not just what's in your head. So that's my advice. I have linked a good public speaker. Vin, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I apologize if I'm getting this wrong. Zhang, I think is his last name. He's Australian, I think. Or he speaks with an Australian accent if he's not Australian. And I don't know if he is or isn't a believer, but he has really good advice on public speaking. And I've linked one of his YouTube videos in the notes. It's really good advice. So if all this is new to you and you're like, I don't know, I've never really thought about that, I encourage you to watch videos from a person like him who's going to give good advice.
Yeah. All right, that's good. So yes, make it natural. Don't make it where you have to turn something on, and monitor how thick you're laying it out there. Our second point is to kind of
can I wait, sorry. Can I pause you here?
Yes, Scott, what else do you
want? Before we get into point 2, this is about points 2, 3, and 4. I wanted to give a warning. You're going to hear these 3 things and you're going to think they're all the same mistake, but they are not. They are similar in kind, but they are distinct mistakes. So I want you to really listen in on each of these because they're not exactly the same. There is some nuance between them. Okay, so there you go.
Yeah. All right. So kicking off the trio is more than one point, not continuously driving towards an overall theme or point, but bringing in a little too much stuff where it does get a little off of center. And Scott, I just kind of thought of this. I mean, we did a previous episode sort of talking about creating the entire environment during your worship time, an entire environment driving towards one thing that you want people to come away with. And that was including music and lighting and, additional ancillary things that go into that. And this is a component of that as well, that your sermon then continues in that, bringing people into one central thing, that at the end of that morning that you have those folks together with you, that's what's going to be in their head. They're going to be reflecting then on, okay, I really understand what this morning was about.
Yeah. So most of us were taught in seminary, like a 3-point sermon is the most typical way that we're taught how to preach. And there's nothing wrong with a 3-point sermon necessarily, unless that 3-point sermon isn't in service of an overall theme or point.
Yeah.
1 point. So I need to have a 1-point sermon, and then any sort of supporting points you have underneath that, I don't think it really matters. It could be 2, it could be 4, it could be 5, it could be 3. But everything needs to be in service of the 1 point that you have. So a mistake I see pastors make sometimes is at the beginning they'll lay out some big idea, but then at the end they'll say something else. There's one thing I want you to take away. It's XYZ, and then that's like the first time they've said that, and it's only tangentially connected to the thing they said at the very beginning. So it's just not well constructed. I mean, that's the criticism, that the sermon itself doesn't have a narrative arc to it where you go, okay, you started here, you ended here. There were pieces in the middle that held the thing together, but it all reinforced this one central arc that you were trying to share. And if you can broaden that out, AJ, as you were saying, to include other things other than the sermon, they're also reinforcing that narrative arc, all of the better. But at minimum, your sermon should have one clear narrative arc that we are tracing through and threading. I'm not suggesting that that's easy to do, but it does require you to show some discernment and go, okay, of all the points I could make about this topic, if you're preaching topically, or about this text, if you're teaching expositionally, what's the 1 point you're choosing to make? This isn't the only time you're ever going to preach on this topic or this passage. Next time you get to it in a couple years, make a different point. But in this sermon, what's the 1 point you want to make? And you have to have some self-discipline in doing that. So the mistake is having too many points, and people will remember none of them.
Yeah. All right. So our next one is having the wrong sized sermon for the time in which you have to preach. So, Scott, some pastors take more seriously on a lot of time than others. And that's, I guess, topic for another episode of organizing a Sunday or whatever day worship service, and how much time is allocated to different things. So I've definitely met, as you have, I'm sure, a lot of pastors that they're just like 20 minutes, okay, so 30 will be fine. It's okay. I don't need to get people out of here on a particular time. Others, I guess, more to this point, might adhere to a particular time slot, but they're like, that's not going to affect how much I decide to say. I'm going to get in every single thing, regardless of when I need to finish. And that's where it ends up getting sometimes even hard to follow. I mean, I've had this more recently. I was with a church, and it just felt super rushed. The sermon was super rushed feeling. And I was like, man, what is going on here? There's a lot of stuff happening. I'm receiving a lot of stuff. Different points, different scripture references. And it was exhausting at the end. I was like, wow, I'm not sure exactly what just happened, but that was a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. So this might sound like, wait, isn't this just the same point you made? No, it's different. The first thing that we said in this sort of triad of problems is, it's poorly constructed. There's not a real clear point. But it may have started and ended on time. It just didn't really it just didn't flow and make sense. In this, it may be poorly constructed, or it may be constructed fine, but you've written 50 minutes of sermon and you have a 30-minute time slot. So the experience of it, you're going to have to speak quickly. You're going to have to run through things. You're going to end up skipping things and going, oh, we'll just not read that passage or whatever. Or you'll run long and it will feel long because everyone knows how long it was supposed to take. So you're not right-sizing the sermon. And this is really important. This also goes back to preparation and to practicing. So you have to know your own habits. For me, if when I rehearse it, if I'm preaching multiple sermons, I'm preaching the same sermon but multiple times, I have to know that the first service probably I'm going to run a couple minutes shorter than my rehearsal, because I know I'm going to tend to move a little bit more quickly because I maybe have more energy and nerves, or not nerves. I don't really get nervous, but you just have a little bit more adrenaline. By the time I get to the second service, I'm much more in the zone, and I may be adding things that weren't in, that come to my mind after having preached it again, whatever. So I know I'm going to maybe run a little. So I try to get as true to time as possible in my rehearsals, knowing that in the first service I may come in a little early, which no one will be sad about, and in second service I don't have the pressure of another service coming up behind me, and so if I run 2 minutes over, that's going to be fine. But I don't want to be in a place where I've planned and I know I'm going to run 5 minutes over. That's when people start to notice. So run through it. You have to run through it. For me, I write my sermons in a particular way where I know how many pages of content and roughly what that's going to come out to in a preached sermon. So as I'm writing, I know, okay, I've hit page 7. I know I've got maybe a half of a page more of wiggle room, and then I'm going to have to start cutting some things. That's not universally true. That's just Scott Ball's sermons. And I know that's 7.5 to 8 pages equals 35 minutes. And so if I have less than that, I'm going to need to cut things. If I've given more time than that, then I'm going to need to add more. You've got to figure out that math. And the number of sermons I've heard, AJ, that are not right-sized, it's too much content in too little a time. It's a problem.
Yep. I would tend more into the too much content. I can accidentally make kind of both mistakes that you talked about, speak a little bit too fast and add things on the fly. I'm like, hey, just thought of something great, I'll throw that in. So my pace is too fast, and I'm like, oh yeah, here's something new just came to mind, I should say it. Like, maybe not.
We all do that, and I think it's important to have that flexibility to be able to add things.
Yeah,
but you have to even account for that in your planning. Go, I know I'm going to add some things, so give yourself some buffer.
Yeah, I could probably improve my rehearsal time. That probably need to spend more time managing that, where I'm more confident after having rehearsed something that it actually will come out that way. Because rehearsal is almost like, I'm in this I don't know, pristine environment, like in the perfect environment. I don't have any feedback. I'm just going through my thing. Here I am, boy. This is sounding good. I'm relaxed.
Yeah. Well, not even that. Like there's a difference, I think, between writing out an anecdote or a story, which we'll talk about those in a minute, and how you're going to say it. And then when you actually start to rehearse it, you think of like, oh, it would be maybe more engaging if I said it this way, or if I, you just don't know. Typing it out and seeing yourself say it versus actually saying it. I can't emphasize enough how important this is. And I really don't think that many pastors who have been doing it for very long, you get to a certain point where you go, well, would that I could, but Saturday night I'm still writing this sucker. Well, that's poor planning. Like you've got to have had it done so you have time to practice it.
Yeah. All right. So the next one, okay, yeah, kind of in your trio here of nuanced points, Scott. Our next one is, you don't need to show all of your work. And this could end up then making the sermon too long. So related more to our previous point of being the wrong size sermon, or that you've got too much study material in there and it takes away from the central theme. So undoubtedly, you're going to come up with some great stuff in your personal study of the text, and then diving into and investigating word meanings in Hebrew or Greek, and maybe looking at different Bible translations for the way other things might be stated. And sometimes that feels awesome. You're like, this is gold. This is what a great point. But
Mhm.
too much gold takes away from the overall, the overall takeaway that you want people to come away with. So you don't
Mhm.
need to give us all of the stuff.
Yeah. So I told you I would confess the thing that I am most likely to fall into, and it's this one. I'm a Bible nerd. I love, AJ knows this about me because I will sometimes randomly just call him on Zoom and be like, here's an interesting Bible fact I discovered today. And that can devolve into a 25-minute conversation about something.
Yeah, and then I grab my Bible and I put my reading glasses on like this, and I'm like, okay, let's do this, man. Let's
let's do it.
let's get to the bottom of this.
Yeah. And when it's, talking to your friend on Zoom, it works. When you're in your sermon, you don't need to highlight every Bible fact. And so, again, you have some discernment and go, this is interesting and this is cool and this is something that people probably don't know, but does it enhance my point? Or by taking the time to go off on this rabbit trail, does it detract from my point, even though it's an interesting thing? And again, that might feel like the same as the first thing or as the second thing, but it's different. It is a knee-jerk reaction to want to insert things that are cool but not relevant. And
Yeah.
two problems with it. One, not only can it distract from your point, but the other thing is you can also come across as kind of a know-it-all. It's like throwing your credentials in people's face. Like no one likes that. It is really off-putting to people when you're like, oh, look how smart I am. And again, just full transparency like that. It's the thing that I struggle with, wanting to do, and I don't think it comes out of a place of pride because I actually don't have like a zillion degrees like some people do. It comes more out of a genuine, like, I find this stuff fascinating and interesting, but they don't always respond to it really well. They're like, why are you telling me this? Cool story, bro. Like it's irrelevant. And so don't do it. This is not your high school math homework. You do not need to show your work. I hope you have done your work in your preparation. It will show in everything else you do if you have done your work. But you don't need to share every cool thing you learned. Not necessary.
Sometimes I think I get hooked into this sometimes. Like as just a congregant member, just sitting there hearing a sermon. If somebody throws something in kind of on the side, I might flip over there then in my Bible and I'm like, what? Is that the correct context that you just threw that in? And I mean, I might miss the next 5 minutes because now I'm doing my own Bible study there in my seat, reading the rest of that chapter.
That's a good point. Yeah, you may actually distract someone. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so now we've got through the three triad things that were all kind of similar but different. Now, last one.
Yeah. So we'll break out of that and into the anecdote problem, Scott. Man, some preachers love some anecdotes, but they don't always land. Sometimes you might even be like, what? What did that have to do with anything? So, see some of our previous points here on whether it was working or not. And gosh, we don't need 3 or 4 of these things in a 25-minute sermon either. So, for goodness sake, some of you calm down on the anecdotes.
Well, I mean, we've all been taught, if you can get people laughing early on, it's good. Then they're engaged, they're hooked, and they're engaged with you. You need a hook. We've all been taught you need a hook at the beginning. And so the problem with it is that it's sometimes it's just forced. Like, I don't love when it's a sermon starts out with, Johnny was in the 3rd grade Sunday school class, and he said to his Sunday school teacher, Miss Nancy, I'm like, I know, I'm immediately, and maybe this is a generational thing, but as a millennial, I guess, I'm immediately thinking, I'll take things that never happened for 500. It's like a cheap laugh. It
Yeah.
sometimes is connected, sometimes it's not connected, but it's like this preacher was told you need a hook and you need a laugh. And I'm here to tell you, you do need a hook, but it doesn't have to be a laugh. And it doesn't have to be right at the very beginning. Like there are ways to use anecdotes creatively. And the thing about an anecdote is it needs to have a payoff. I'm totally okay with you starting with a story that it seems like it's not connected, and then at the end there's a payoff. You looped it back around. That's okay. There's like some narrative tension there. Like, why did he tell this story? But if you're good at preaching, people are going to know he's going to loop this thing back in the end, and that creates, again, that tension. Like, how is this going to weave in? If you're not good, people know, oh, he just needed a story and he threw this in randomly. You should always give more weight to stories that are your own versus stories that you've found on Google or heard from someone else. Prioritize stories that are yours, because you're going to be able to, it goes back to the first point about tone and pacing. If I'm telling a story about something that happened to me, or, then I'm much more able to embody that story than if it's something I read about. You can incorporate another way to weave in an anecdote is to bring in some expert type thing, like C.S. Lewis did blah, 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 and some interesting fact about that you can weave in. There are other types of things that you can do, but think through it. The anecdote, it's a real problem. Like, don't just think, oh, I have to have something, and so then you insert just something. Think about it. Think about what you're using and how you're going to use it in a way that there's some sort of a payoff in the sermon itself.
Yeah. Yeah. If during your sermon prep, you've got numerous Bibles out, Bible dictionary, and 300 jokes for pastors on your desk, stop.
Yeah. I guess related to this, AJ, like, let's stuff all these things in the same category. If you're going to have a movie clip, if you're going to have some pre-sermon, it's not a movie clip, but just like some stock thing that you bought on christianvideo.com, if you're going to have some sort of an object lesson, anything like that, like it has to have a payoff. And it has to reinforce that main point and not be distracting in some way.
Yeah. It's been Scott, our church recently is in a sermon series, and they've put together the video roll that runs at the beginning. And I'm distracted every week because the video clips, it's like plugging in the sermon series is something about, has the word power in it. They use like electrical things, and they're like European plugs. And it's so distracting to me. I'm like, why is this video full of European
Why is the
plugs?
stock video for your sermon bumper?
We couldn't get an American plug.
And you live in Texas, so you're really offended. You're like, I need a Texas plug.
How come Texas doesn't have its own shape outlets? I think that would be in line with our value system. All right, keep them relatable, guys. Keep them relatable. All right, so there you go. We talked about having good pacing, good tempo, not being too on, or this affectation of who you are in your delivery, keeping to a main theme, keeping on to a good time in which your presentation is good. It doesn't feel rushed or not full of a bunch of extra stuff that would distract, and then just some cheap laughs and unrelated storytelling. And so yeah, there you go. It was called The Anatomy of a Bad Sermon, but you just flip that to the other side of that coin, and it also is the anatomy of a good sermon on what you don't do and
That's
what
right.
you do.
I want to end with this thought, AJ. A really good sermon is simple. And I want to clarify what I mean by that. Your smartphone that you are maybe listening to this podcast on, or sitting in your pocket, it's very simple to use. You tap a few buttons, and you could be chatting with someone on the other side of the globe. You tap a few other buttons, and then you're accessing all the knowledge of collective knowledge of mankind via the internet. And you tap some other buttons and you are transported to a world of games and entertainment. Like it's so simple. Toddlers can figure out how to use it. But beneath that glass of your screen on your smartphone is a high degree of complexity. There are circuits and there's all kinds of things that I can't even explain how they work.
That's pretty technical, Scott. It's got circuits, does it?
It's got circuits. It has circuits and binary code, and it's
got electronics and circuits
and batteries and all things. There is a level of complexity beneath the glass that clearly I don't understand and can't even articulate. Your sermon should be this way, that the experience of your sermon should be so simple. I understand it. I hear what you're saying. I grasp the point. And I can even access some level of profundity, right? Some depth, some meaning. And yet behind the pulpit, so to speak, there is a level of complexity there that shows you've done your work. Simple doesn't mean simplistic. I don't mean junior high boy putting together his very first Devo. He's read the passage, and just the most obvious thing that he possibly could have drawn is the thing that he's saying. I'm not saying that. I'm saying real simplicity is the distillation of complexity. And that's what a good sermon is.
Quite a sentence there. I like that.
Yeah, man. So that's what it takes. And it takes hard work. It's a high calling, preaching and teaching the word. And I know it's hard. Most jobs, you don't have to put together a professional, high quality, well-researched presentation of 25 to 45 minutes, depending on your church, every Sunday, once a week. Some people go their whole careers and never have to do that one time, and you have to do it every Sunday. I understand how hard that is, but that's the calling. And so don't take the shortcuts and don't fall victim to these bad sermon habits.
Amen. And with that, thanks for being with us. You can read today's show notes over at malphursgroup.com/191, and we'll see you next week.